in the marble halls of Renaissance Florence, where power shifted like shadows at dusk, Niccolò Machiavelli observed a truth that would echo through centuries. The leader who remains emotionally detached from the storms of governance possesses an unassailable fortress within himself. This was not the cold indifference of a tyrant, but the calculated distance of a master strategist who understood that proximity breeds both familiarity and contempt. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Piazza della Signoria as Lorenzo de' Medici emerged from his private chambers, his face a mask of composed authority. The previous evening had brought news of a conspiracy against his rule, whispers of discontent among the merchant families, and threats from rival city-states. Yet his demeanor betrayed nothing of the tempest that surely raged within. This was the first lesson Machiavelli would later codify. The leader must be like a lighthouse, visible from afar yet untouchable by the waves that crash against its foundation. The art of detachment begins with understanding the fundamental paradox of leadership. To serve many, one must belong to none. The leader who becomes too invested in the approval of his subjects, too dependent on their affection, too wounded by their criticism, has already surrendered the very distance that makes effective governance possible. Machiavelli witnessed this truth repeatedly in the courts of his time, where princes fell not because they were cruel, but because they were too kind, not because they were distant, but because they were too accessible. Consider the case of Piero Soderini, the Gonfaloniere of Florence, whom Machiavelli served directly. Soderini was a man of genuine virtue, beloved by the people for his accessibility and warmth. Citizens could approach him in the streets, merchants could voice their concerns directly, and nobles felt comfortable expressing their opinions freely in his presence. Yet this very approachability became his undoing. When the political winds shifted and the Medici returned to power, those same people who had praised his openness abandoned him without hesitation. His weakness was not in his policies or his intelligence, but in his emotional investment in being liked. The detached leader understands that affection is a luxury he cannot afford, not because he is incapable of love, but because love makes one vulnerable to manipulation. When Caesar crossed the Rubicon, he did not do so because he hated Rome, but because he understood that his attachment to Roman approval had become a chain that bound him to mediocrity. The moment he chose to act independently of popular opinion, he transformed from a politician into a force of nature. This transformation requires the systematic destruction of what Machiavelli termed the weak self, that collection of insecurities, emotional dependencies, and social anxieties that plague ordinary men. The weak self seeks validation from others, fears criticism, and measures success through the lens of external approval. It is the part of a man that needs to be liked, that craves acceptance, that suffers when others speak ill of him. For a leader, this weak self is not merely a burden. It is a fundamental threat to effective governance. The process of destroying this weak self is neither quick nor painless. It requires the leader to confront every aspect of his personality that depends on others for validation. Marcus Aurelius, in his private meditations, wrestled with this challenge daily, reminding himself that the universe is change. Our life is what our thoughts make it. The Roman emperor understood that his effectiveness as a leader depended not on how others perceived him, but on his ability to act according to rational principles regardless of external pressure. The leader must learn to view criticism not as an attack on his person, but as information about the effectiveness of his policies. When the citizens of Florence complained about new taxes, Machiavelli advised his prince not to take offense but to analyze whether the complaints indicated a flaw in implementation or simply the natural resistance people have to sacrifice. This analytical distance allows the leader to make adjustments based on practical considerations rather than emotional reactions. But detachment is not indifference. The detached leader cares deeply about outcomes while remaining emotionally neutral about the methods required to achieve them. This is perhaps the most sophisticated aspect of Machiavellian leadership, the ability to act with ruthless efficiency in service of a higher purpose while maintaining personal equilibrium. When Cesare Borgia conquered the Romagna, he did not take pleasure in the violence required, nor did he shrink from it in moral horror. He simply recognized it as a necessary tool for bringing stability to a chaotic region. This emotional neutrality extends to the leader's relationship with his own subordinates. The effective leader cannot allow personal friendships to cloud his judgment about competence and loyalty. Napoleon's marshals understood this principle intimately. They served not because they were his friends, but because they recognized his superiority as a strategic mind. When military necessity required difficult decisions about personnel, Napoleon made them without regard for personal feelings, and his marshals respected him more, not less, for this clarity. The cultivation of detachment also requires the leader to develop what might be called strategic empathy, the ability to understand others' motivations and emotions without being controlled by them. This is different from the common understanding of empathy, which often involves emotional identification with others' suffering. Strategic empathy allows the leader to predict behavior, anticipate reactions, and design policies that account for human nature, without being paralyzed by sympathy for those who must bear the costs of necessary change. When Machiavelli observed successful leaders, he noted their ability to shift perspectives rapidly, seeing situations from multiple angles without becoming trapped in any single viewpoint. They could understand the grievances of the poor without being overwhelmed by pity, recognize the ambitions of the wealthy without being seduced by flattery, and appreciate the concerns of foreign ambassadors without being manipulated by their arguments. This cognitive flexibility is impossible when one's emotions are invested in maintaining a particular self-image or securing specific outcomes. The leader's detachment must also extend to his own previous decisions. The weak self clings to past choices, defending them long after their utility has expired, because admitting error feels like a personal attack on one's competence. The strong leader views past decisions as experiments that either succeeded or failed, providing data for future choices but carrying no emotional weight. When circumstances change, the detached leader adapts without the psychological burden of having to justify continuity for its own sake. This principle becomes particularly important during crises, when rapid adaptation often means abandoning strategies that once seemed wise. During the invasion of Italy by foreign powers, successful Italian leaders were those who could quickly abandon traditional alliances and defensive positions when new realities demanded different approaches. Those who remained emotionally attached to old strategies, either from pride or from loyalty to past allies, found themselves crushed by more adaptive opponents. The destruction of the weak self also involves developing immunity to both praise and blame. The leader who becomes intoxicated by flattery is as vulnerable as one who is crushed by criticism. Both responses indicate emotional dependence on external validation. The truly detached leader receives praise as information about what others find valuable and criticism as data about areas requiring attention, but neither moves him from his chosen course unless rational analysis supports such movement. This psychological independence creates what Machiavelli called the inner citadel, a core of self-possession that remains intact regardless of external circumstances. When enemies attack, when allies betray, when fortune turns against him, the leader with a strong inner citadel continues to function effectively because his sense of purpose and method does not depend on external support. This is not stoicism for its own sake, but a practical necessity for anyone who would lead in a world where change is constant and loyalty is rare. The development of this inner citadel requires daily practice in emotional discipline. The leader must train himself to observe his own reactions, identifying moments when his decisions are influenced more by feeling than by reason. This self-awareness allows him to pause, analyze, and choose responses that serve his larger purposes rather than his immediate emotional needs. Like a skilled physician who remains calm during surgery despite the patient's suffering, the leader must maintain operational clarity despite the emotional turbulence that surrounds all significant action. Yet this detachment must never become visible as coldness or arrogance, for the leader still depends on others' cooperation to achieve his goals. The art lies in maintaining internal distance, while projecting whatever external image best serves the situation. Sometimes this requires appearing sympathetic, sometimes stern, sometimes uncertain, sometimes confident. The key is that these presentations are strategic choices rather than emotional compulsions. As the afternoon light began to fade over Florence, Lorenzo de' Medici concluded his audiences for the day. Each petitioner had left feeling heard. Each merchant had received what seemed like personal attention. Each noble had been treated with appropriate respect. Yet throughout these interactions, Lorenzo had remained fundamentally untouchable, evaluating each request according to its merit and its alignment with his larger vision for the city. This was the paradox Machiavelli would spend his life exploring: how to serve others completely while belonging to them not at all. The foundation of detached leadership, therefore, rests on this fundamental recognition. The leader's primary relationship is not with any individual or group, but with the principles and purposes that guide his action. All other relationships, however warm they may appear, are subordinate to this primary commitment. Only by establishing this hierarchy can the leader escape the emotional traps that destroy lesser men and achieve the clarity of vision necessary for effective governance. Part 2. The mechanics of strategic isolation. The second dimension of Machiavellian leadership involves the practical implementation of strategic isolation, not the isolation of a hermit who withdraws from the world, but the calculated distance of a conductor who stands apart from the orchestra to achieve perfect harmony. This form of isolation is active rather than passive, requiring the leader to engage constantly with others while maintaining an internal barrier that prevents emotional contamination of his judgment. The morning found Francesco Sforza in his private study, maps of Lombardy spread before him like a chessboard made manifest. Reports from his spies filled neat piles on his desk. Intelligence about Venetian troop movements, assessments of Florentine merchant sentiment, analyses of French diplomatic intentions. Each piece of information had been filtered through multiple sources before reaching him, creating layers of distance between his decision-making process and the raw emotions of those who provided the data. This systematic approach to information gathering exemplified the first principle of strategic isolation. The leader must never receive unfiltered emotional content directly from those affected by his decisions. When subjects approach their ruler with complaints, their words carry not just factual information, but emotional contagion. The merchant whose trade routes have been disrupted does not simply report economic data, he communicates his fear, anger, and desperation. The noble whose privileges have been curtailed does not merely describe policy changes, he transmits his sense of betrayal and wounded pride. The common citizen facing new taxes does not only explain financial hardship, he shares his feelings of helplessness and resentment. For the leader to maintain clarity, he must create mechanisms that extract the useful information while filtering out the emotional content that could cloud his judgment. This does not mean the leader ignores emotions. Rather, he treats them as data to be analyzed rather than experiences to be shared. When Sforza learned that certain merchants were angry about new trade regulations, he did not dismiss their anger as irrelevant. Instead, he analyzed what their emotional response revealed about the policy's impact, whether modifications were needed to maintain economic stability, and how their feelings might be channeled toward productive outcomes. The anger itself was neither good nor bad. It was simply information about the system's current state. The creation of informational buffers requires careful construction of what might be called layers of translation. The leader establishes trusted advisors whose role is not to agree with him, but to convert raw intelligence into analyzed assessments. These advisors must themselves possess sufficient detachment to resist being overwhelmed by the emotions of those they interview, yet retain enough sensitivity to accurately gauge the intensity and significance of various feelings within the population. Machiavelli observed that the most effective leaders surrounded themselves with advisors who understood this delicate balance. They were neither so cold as to miss important emotional undercurrents, nor so warm as to be paralyzed by sympathy for every hardship their policies caused. These advisors served as emotional lightning rods, absorbing the effective content of public sentiment while delivering clear, rational analyses to their leader. The second aspect of strategic isolation involves the careful management of physical presence. The leader cannot be everywhere at once, and his choices about when and where to appear personally carry enormous significance. Every public appearance creates expectations, establishes precedents, and generates emotional responses that can either enhance or undermine his authority. The art lies in being present often enough to maintain connection while remaining absent frequently enough to preserve mystique. Consider how Caesar managed his relationship with the Roman mob. He appeared regularly at public games and festivals, demonstrating his connection to the people's pleasures and concerns. Yet he also maintained private spaces where ordinary citizens could not follow, creating an aura of elevated authority that made his public appearances feel like gifts rather than obligations. This careful calibration of accessibility required constant attention to the psychological effects of presence and absence. The leader must understand that his physical presence carries emotional weight that can overwhelm rational discourse. When the ruler enters a room, the dynamics change instantly. Some people become nervous, others excited, still others calculating. These emotional reactions, while natural, interfere with clear communication and objective assessment of situations. Therefore, the wise leader often gathers information through intermediaries, reserving his personal presence for moments when his direct involvement serves specific strategic purposes. This principle extends to the leader's living arrangements and daily routines. The palace is not merely a residence but a tool for maintaining psychological distance. Its architecture should communicate authority while its accessibility should be carefully controlled. Too much grandeur creates resentment. Too little fails to inspire respect. The leader's daily schedule becomes an instrument of statecraft, with each meeting, meal, and public appearance calculated to reinforce his position while advancing his objectives. The third element of strategic isolation concerns emotional contagion and its prevention. Human beings are naturally empathetic creatures whose feelings tend to mirror those around them. In ordinary social situations, this emotional synchronization helps build bonds and facilitate cooperation. For leaders, however, emotional contagion represents a serious threat to rational decision-making. When the leader begins to feel what his subjects feel, he loses the objectivity necessary for difficult choices. The prevention of emotional contagion requires systematic training in psychological self-regulation. The leader must learn to observe emotions in others without absorbing them, to understand suffering without experiencing it, to recognize joy without being elevated by it. This is not callousness but professional discipline, similar to how a surgeon must maintain steady hands despite the patient's pain, or how a judge must remain impartial despite compelling testimony. Marcus Aurelius developed sophisticated techniques for maintaining this emotional independence. In his personal writings, he reminded himself daily that other people's opinions and feelings were external events that could not harm his essential self unless he chose to let them. He practiced viewing emotional situations from multiple perspectives, imagining how the same events would appear to future historians or foreign observers who lacked direct involvement. The emperor also cultivated what he called the view from above, the ability to see immediate events within larger temporal and spatial contexts. When facing criticism from the Senate or complaints from provincial governors, he would imagine how these concerns would appear from the perspective of cosmic history. This practice did not make him indifferent to immediate problems, but it prevented temporary emotional pressures from distorting his judgment about long-term solutions. The fourth aspect of strategic isolation involves the management of personal relationships within the leader's inner circle. The leader needs advisors and confidants, but these relationships must be carefully structured to serve governance rather than personal emotional needs. The ruler who seeks friendship from subordinates has already compromised his ability to make difficult decisions about their competence and loyalty. This does not mean the leader must be cruel or dismissive toward those who serve him. Indeed, the most effective leaders often displayed great warmth and consideration toward their subordinates. The key difference was that this warmth was extended as a gift rather than exchanged as part of an emotional transaction. The leader gave consideration without expecting affection in return, and he received loyalty without feeling obligated to reciprocate with inappropriate favoritism. Napoleon exemplified this principle in his relationships with his marshals. He could be charming, generous, and even affectionate with them in private moments, but he never allowed personal feelings to interfere with military necessity. When Marshal Murat's personal ambitions threatened the empire's interests, Napoleon removed him from command without hesitation or explanation. The marshals understood this clarity, and rather than feeling betrayed, they respected the emperor more for his consistency. The leader must also resist the temptation to seek emotional support from family members about matters of state. The roles of ruler and father, sovereign and husband, cannot be merged without compromising both. Family members who become informal advisors inevitably bring emotional considerations that cloud practical judgment. They care about the leader's personal happiness and reputation in ways that may conflict with effective governance. The fifth element of strategic isolation concerns the leader's relationship with public opinion. Democratic theory suggests that leaders should be responsive to popular will, but Machiavelli understood that public opinion is often emotional, changeable, and based on incomplete information. The effective leader must gauge public sentiment without being controlled by it, must understand popular concerns without being paralyzed by them. The management of public opinion requires sophisticated understanding of mass psychology. People's political feelings are influenced more by symbols and stories than by rational analysis of policies. They respond to confidence and clarity more than to detailed explanations of complex choices. They prefer simple narratives about heroes and villains to nuanced discussions of competing interests and inevitable trade-offs. The detached leader learns to provide the symbols and narratives people need without allowing these communications to constrain his actual decision-making. He presents simplified versions of complex situations, not to deceive the public, but to enable them to support necessary actions they lack, the information or expertise to fully understand. This is not manipulation, but translation, converting sophisticated analysis into accessible emotional content. Roosevelt's management of American entry into World War II demonstrated this principle. He understood that the American people needed to feel that they were responding to clear aggression rather than making calculated geopolitical choices. He therefore framed the conflict in terms of defending democracy against tyranny, providing an emotional framework that enabled popular support for difficult decisions, without requiring citizens to grapple with the full complexity of international relations. The sixth aspect of strategic isolation involves the leader's relationship with his own past decisions and future reputation. The weak leader becomes emotionally invested in being proven right about previous choices and being remembered favorably by history. These emotional attachments prevent the adaptation and course correction that effective governance requires. The strong leader treats past decisions as experiments that either succeeded or failed, providing data for future choices without carrying emotional weight. When circumstances change, he adapts without the psychological burden of having to justify continuity for its own sake. When new information suggests that previous policies were mistaken, he changes course without feeling that his competence or reputation has been challenged. This emotional independence from past decisions becomes particularly important during crises, when rapid adaptation often requires abandoning strategies that once seemed wise. The leader who remains attached to old approaches, either from pride or from concern about appearing inconsistent, will find himself crushed by more adaptive opponents. Similarly, the effective leader must maintain independence from concerns about historical reputation. While he naturally hopes to be remembered favorably, he cannot allow this desire to influence immediate decisions that serve present necessities. The leader who tries to ensure his positive legacy while in office often makes choices that serve his future reputation rather than current needs. As evening approached, Francesco Sforza concluded his day's work and retired to his private chambers. The maps had been studied, the reports analyzed, the decisions made. Tomorrow would bring new challenges requiring new responses. But tonight he could rest secure in the knowledge that his judgment had remained clear, his emotions controlled, his perspective uncontaminated by the urgent feelings of those whose lives hung in the balance of his choices. This was the essence of strategic isolation. Not withdrawal from the world, but engagement with it from a position of psychological sovereignty that served both his own effectiveness and the welfare of those he governed. The mechanics of strategic isolation therefore create a paradox that lies at the heart of effective leadership. The leader serves others best when he belongs to them least. By maintaining emotional distance, filtering information systematically, managing presence carefully, preventing emotional contagion, structuring personal relationships appropriately, handling public opinion skillfully, and remaining independent of past decisions and future reputation, the leader creates the psychological space necessary for rational analysis and effective action. This isolation is not coldness but clarity, not indifference but objectivity. Not withdrawal, but the ultimate form of engagement. Part 3. The Invincible Mind. Beyond destruction and creation, the final dimension of Machiavellian leadership transcends the mere tactics of governance to achieve what the ancient Stoics called the invincible mind, a psychological state in which external circumstances lose their power to disturb one's essential functioning. This is not the temporary confidence of success or the desperate resolve of desperation, but a fundamental restructuring of consciousness that makes the leader truly undefeatable, not because he cannot lose battles, but because his core effectiveness no longer depends on winning them. The concept of invincibility that Machiavelli observed in the greatest leaders was not physical invulnerability, but psychological autonomy. The truly powerful leader could lose battles, face betrayal, endure criticism, suffer setbacks, and yet continue to function with undiminished clarity and purpose. This resilience came not from external resources, but from an internal organization of mind that remained stable regardless of circumstances. On a fog-shrouded morning in early winter, Cesare Borgia received word that his father, Pope Alexander VI, lay dying in Rome. The messenger's hands shook as he delivered news that would normally devastate any son, and certainly destroy any political leader whose power depended entirely on papal support. Yet as the words reached him, Cesare's expression remained unchanged, his voice steady as he issued orders for immediate action. Within hours, he had dispatched troops to secure strategic positions, sent agents to gather intelligence about rival factions' movements, and begun negotiations with potential allies who might fill the power vacuum. His grief, if it existed, would wait. His fear, if he felt it, would not be permitted to interfere with necessary action. This response exemplified the psychological architecture that Machiavelli considered essential for ultimate leadership. The ability to process any information, no matter how personally devastating, as simply another factor requiring appropriate response rather than as an emotional event demanding an emotional reaction. The invincible mind treats all external circumstances as data to be analyzed and challenges to be met, but never as definitions of the self or determinants of fundamental capability. The construction of such psychological invincibility begins with understanding the relationship between identity and role. Most people's sense of self is intimately connected to their social position, their relationships, their possessions, and their reputation. When these external elements are threatened, their entire sense of reality becomes unstable. The leader who would be truly undefeatable must develop what might be called identity sovereignty, a core sense of self that exists independent of any particular role or circumstance. This sovereign identity is not built on what one has or what others think, but on one's capacity to analyze, decide, and act according to rational principles, regardless of external pressure. Marcus Aurelius captured this concept when he reminded himself that you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. The emperor understood that true strength lay not in controlling circumstances, but in maintaining clarity about what could and could not be controlled. The development of identity sovereignty requires systematic examination of every assumption about what constitutes success, failure, safety, danger, honor, and shame. The leader must identify which of these concepts serve effective decision-making and which merely reflect social conditioning that can be exploited by enemies. For example, many leaders are paralyzed by threats to their reputation because they have unconsciously accepted society's definition of honor. The sovereign leader develops his own standards of excellence that may or may not align with popular opinion. This process of psychological archaeology often reveals how many supposedly rational fears are actually emotional attachments dressed in logical clothing. The leader who claims to fear a particular policy because it might damage the economy may actually fear it because it would force him to confront his own limitations or challenge relationships he values for personal reasons. The invincible mind learns to distinguish between legitimate practical concerns and disguised emotional dependencies. The second element of psychological invincibility involves developing what might be called outcome independence. This does not mean indifference to results, but rather emotional detachment from any specific result. The leader with an invincible mind works intensively toward his goals while remaining psychologically prepared for any outcome, including complete failure. This paradoxical combination of total commitment with total acceptance creates enormous strategic flexibility and psychological stability. When Napoleon faced the coalition of European powers arrayed against him, his effectiveness came not from confidence in victory, but from complete preparation for any possibility. He developed detailed plans for multiple scenarios, from total triumph to complete defeat, and his emotional equilibrium remained stable regardless of which scenario materialized. This allowed him to adapt rapidly to changing circumstances without the psychological shock that paralyzes leaders who have invested their identity in particular outcomes. The cultivation of outcome independence requires daily practice in accepting uncertainty and preparing for multiple possibilities. The leader must train himself to say, "I will work toward this goal with complete dedication, but I am prepared to accept and respond effectively to any result." This is not pessimism but realism combined with psychological flexibility. The third aspect of the invincible mind concerns the relationship between power and security. Most leaders seek power as a means of achieving security, protection from enemies, guarantee of resources, assurance of continued influence. But Machiavelli observed that this approach creates a fundamental vulnerability. The leader's psychological stability becomes dependent on maintaining external power, which by definition depends partly on factors beyond his control. The truly invincible leader reverses this relationship, using power as an expression of internal security rather than a means of achieving it. His psychological stability comes from his capacity to analyze, decide, and act effectively, regardless of his formal position or available resources. This internal security then enables him to use whatever power he possesses more effectively, since he is not paralyzed by fear of losing it. This reversal requires the leader to develop what might be called minimum viable effectiveness, the ability to function productively even when stripped of all external supports. Like a master craftsman who can create beautiful work with crude tools, or a brilliant teacher who can educate students in any setting, the invincible leader must be able to influence events and guide people regardless of his formal authority or available resources. The development of minimum viable effectiveness involves identifying the irreducible core of one's capabilities, those skills and insights that remain intact regardless of circumstances. For most great leaders, this core includes the ability to read situations accurately, to understand human motivation, to design practical solutions to complex problems, and to communicate persuasively with various types of people. These capabilities can be exercised from any position, whether emperor or exile. The fourth element of psychological invincibility concerns the transcendence of conventional moral categories. This is perhaps the most misunderstood aspect of Machiavellian thought, often interpreted as cynical amorality when it actually represents a sophisticated ethical framework designed for the unique moral challenges of leadership. The conventional moral categories that guide ordinary social interaction, kindness, honesty, loyalty, fairness, assume stable conditions and mutual good faith that rarely exist in political environments. The leader who remains bound by these categories when facing opponents who ignore them will find himself systematically outmaneuvered by those willing to use more flexible approaches. The invincible mind develops what might be called contextual ethics, the ability to choose appropriate moral frameworks for different situations while maintaining consistent commitment to ultimate objectives. This requires the leader to become comfortable with moral complexity and paradox, accepting that serving the greater good sometimes requires actions that would be inappropriate in ordinary circumstances. When Cesare Borgia used deception and force to bring stability to the Romagna, he was not abandoning moral consideration but applying a different moral framework than would be appropriate for normal social interaction. His ultimate objective was to reduce the overall suffering caused by constant warfare between petty tyrants. The methods he employed were harsh, but they served a moral purpose that could not be achieved through conventional means. The leader with an invincible mind understands that moral purity is often a luxury that those responsible for others' welfare cannot afford. This does not make him amoral, but rather forces him to grapple with moral questions at a level of sophistication that ordinary people need not contemplate. He must be willing to accept moral responsibility for necessary actions that others would find unthinkable, bearing the psychological burden of complexity that comes with ultimate responsibility. The fifth aspect of psychological invincibility involves the integration of reason and intuition into what might be called strategic consciousness. This is neither purely rational analysis nor emotional impulse, but a form of awareness that simultaneously processes logical, emotional, and intuitive information to arrive at optimal decisions under uncertainty. The development of strategic consciousness requires the leader to become comfortable with paradox and ambiguity. Real-world situations rarely present themselves as clear logical problems with obvious solutions. Instead, they involve multiple competing values, incomplete information, uncertain consequences, and time pressure that prevents exhaustive analysis. The invincible mind learns to synthesize all available information, rational, emotional, and intuitive, into coherent action, without being paralyzed by uncertainty or seduced by false clarity. This integrated awareness allows the leader to read situations at multiple levels simultaneously. He can analyze the logical structure of a problem while sensing the emotional undercurrents that might affect implementation, while intuiting unstated motivations that could influence outcomes. This multidimensional awareness provides enormous advantages in complex social environments where purely rational analysis often misses crucial factors. The cultivation of strategic consciousness requires practice in what might be called soft focus attention, the ability to maintain broad awareness rather than narrow concentration. Like a martial artist who must simultaneously track his opponent's hands, feet, eyes, and body position, the leader must learn to process multiple streams of information without becoming fixated on any single element. The sixth and final element of the invincible mind concerns what Machiavelli called the view from eternity, the ability to see immediate events within larger temporal contexts that provide both perspective and equanimity. This is not escapism or philosophical abstraction, but a practical tool for maintaining clarity during crisis and making decisions that serve long-term rather than short-term interests. When facing immediate challenges that seem overwhelming, the leader with an invincible mind can shift perspective to see how the current situation fits within larger historical patterns, how present difficulties might serve future development, and how temporary setbacks might ultimately advance long-term objectives. This temporal flexibility prevents the psychological tunnel vision that destroys effectiveness during crisis. Marcus Aurelius developed sophisticated practices for maintaining this expanded temporal perspective. When facing barbarian invasions on the frontier, he would remind himself that Rome had survived countless similar challenges, that civilizations rose and fell according to natural cycles, and that his role was to play his part with excellence regardless of ultimate outcomes. This perspective did not make him passive but rather freed him from the emotional disruption that comes from taking immediate events too personally. The view from eternity also enables the leader to make decisions that may not be popular or immediately beneficial, but serve larger purposes that span multiple generations. The leader who can see beyond his own lifetime is freed from the constraint of needing to see results within his own tenure, allowing him to plant seeds that others will harvest and lay foundations that others will build upon. As dawn broke over the Romagna, Cesare Borgia stood on the battlements of his stronghold, surveying the territories he had unified through years of careful strategy and calculated action. The morning mist rising from the valleys below seemed to symbolize the uncertainty that surrounded all human endeavors. Yet his mind remained clear and his purpose unwavering. Whether he would hold these lands for decades or lose them within months mattered less than the fact that he had demonstrated the possibility of imposing rational order on chaos, of creating stability through intelligent action, of serving a vision that transcended personal ambition. This was the essence of the invincible mind. Not the guarantee of success, but the capacity to act with full effectiveness regardless of outcome. Not the elimination of uncertainty, but the ability to function optimally within it. Not the avoidance of difficulty, but the transformation of every challenge into an opportunity for demonstrating mastery. The leader who achieved this psychological state could not be destroyed by external forces because his essential capability no longer depended on external conditions. The man who destroys his weak self, that collection of emotional dependencies, social anxieties, and identity attachments that make ordinary people vulnerable to manipulation and breakdown, creates in its place a sovereign consciousness that serves others precisely because it belongs to no one. This transformation is not the work of days or weeks, but of years and decades, requiring constant vigilance, continuous practice, and unwavering commitment to growth beyond the comfortable limitations of conventional psychology. Yet for those who achieve even partial success in this transformation, the rewards extend far beyond personal effectiveness. The leader with an invincible mind becomes a force for stability and progress in a world of chaos and confusion. It demonstrates by example that human beings can transcend their apparent limitations, that rational action can prevail over emotional impulse, that long-term vision can overcome short-term pressure. In serving his own development towards psychological sovereignty, he serves the larger human project of creating societies worthy of our highest aspirations. The art of detachment, when fully mastered, thus reveals itself not as withdrawal from human concerns, but as the ultimate form of engagement with them. The leader who has destroyed his weak self can never be destroyed by others because he has become something more durable than any individual personality. He has become a principle in action, a rational force working through human form toward goals that benefit not only his immediate followers, but the broader human community that depends on effective leadership for its continued development. This is Machiavelli's final and most profound insight, that true power comes not from controlling others, but from mastering oneself. Not from accumulating external resources, but from developing internal capabilities that remain effective regardless of circumstances. The prince who achieves this mastery becomes truly invincible, not because he cannot fail, but because his essential capacity to serve human flourishing can never be destroyed by any external force. In the end, the greatest leaders in history were those who transformed themselves into instruments of purposes larger than their personal desires, who destroyed their weak selves to become vehicles for principles and visions that served humanity's continuing evolution toward greater wisdom, justice, and prosperity. They led from above, not through arrogance or indifference, but through the clarity of vision and steadiness of purpose that comes only from complete psychological sovereignty. This is the ultimate masterclass that Machiavelli offers. Not merely how to gain and hold power, but how to become worthy of wielding it in service of our species' highest potential. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others, for he has become something more durable than any individual ambition. He has become a rational force working through human form toward goals that transcend personal limitation and serve the endless human project of creating order from chaos, meaning from confusion, and progress from the raw materials of possibility. Document complete.